So I'm going to continue teaching through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, just as I've been doing. And my title for this section has been Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And we've not really quite gotten to much of the judgment yet. So much of what we've seen so far has been more like putting the pieces on the board, so to speak. And the real way we've been doing that is in going through this first portion of the section, which I have called the Divine King Openly Observed. And I've been calling it that because this is a time when Jesus is far more willing to make his divine kingship more openly known to the people of Israel. And I think he's doing that because he's about to make those very stirring statements of judgment that he has on his mind for the city of Jerusalem in particular. And he is setting forth who he is and showing them who he is before he does that. So that is what we've been doing, and that's what we're still doing now. Now, in my past two messages, we've been talking about Jesus entering Jerusalem and everything around that, how Israel responded, what he was doing at that time. In today's sermon, I'm beginning a three-part sermon series on the first thing Jesus did once he actually entered Jerusalem. So we're again starting a kind of mini-series of 3 sermons. Now I have a question for the children, and this is a chance, as always, for the younger people among us to show how much they know and impress us all with their knowledge. I was going to ask the children this morning if you know what the temple actually was back there in Jerusalem in the days of Jesus, what the temple was. Anyone want to try to answer that question? Selena wants to try. Go ahead. Yes, they sacrificed animals because they were told to do that by God in the law to atone for their sins. That was before Jesus came, of course. So yes, that's one thing that happened in the temple. Anything else happening in the temple? What this place was supposed to be? Anyone else want to try? Hannah. Supposed to pray there. Yes, it was supposed to be a house of prayer for sure. A lot of things happening there in the temple. Basically, it was the place where God was said to dwell among his people. It was considered the house of God. You went there to offer sacrifices to God. You could go there to pray to God. You could go there to worship God. There were people singing songs there as well. All of that is what was happening in the temple during the days of Jesus. So, in terms of how a person is supposed to act while he's there at the temple, you would think that they're supposed to act in a certain way. You might say they act in a way that's respectful, in a way that is controlled. It's kind of like you kids, how your parents are always telling you to, sit still and behave when you're here in church. If you can imagine that on a much larger scale, that's the kind of behavior you're supposed to have there at the temple. This is a place for serious things. This is where God is worshiped. This is where you come, in some sense, to meet with God in that temple. So I'm going to read you a story that might surprise you after everything I've just said about something Jesus did when he went to the temple during the last week of his life here on the earth. We're going to see how he acted. So this is Matthew 21, verses 12 through 13. Okay, it says, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all of those people who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den.'" So there's Jesus going into the temple, flipping over tables, chasing people around. If you can imagine that sort of thing happening, maybe at the time later on in church today when we have tables set up and everything, just someone coming in and just flipping the tables over, chasing people around, people running for the door, because there's this guy running around trying to drive people out. That's what Jesus did when he went to the temple. And I guess if there's anything I would tell you kids here at the beginning that you can keep in your minds for everything I'm saying, is just to remember that Jesus almost never does what you think he's going to do. You would think of all people going to the temple, he would be the most worshipful person there, the one who's acting exactly the way he should, but he goes in there and he just creates chaos when he goes into the temple. And he has a reason for doing those things, and we're talking about that in these sermons I have in mind. But that's what Jesus was doing. So not at all what you would expect, not what anyone expected, but that is what Christ did when he went to the temple. Now, as I said, I'm about to spend 3 messages on only 2 verses. Those were only 2 verses there, but I have a lot to talk about on these things. This is one of those important events in the life of Jesus, so it bears, a lot of weight in talking about things that Christ is doing. So my sermon today is somewhat limited. My title is simply Jesus Attacks, right? Because I think if you had been there at the time when Jesus was there in the temple, you would say Jesus attacked the temple. I know we usually have more reverent ways of describing that, but if you were there on that day, Jesus attacked the temple. That's what he did. And that's what I've titled this sermon. Now, my outline for today is limited to 3 things. All of these are just what might be called background information. We're not really getting into any of the heavy stuff that's here in this passage. We're not there yet. But I have some things to say that are necessary to get your mind in the right place as we go through the sermons I have written on this passage. So I have 3 things like that for you today. They're all somewhat, separate from each other, so you can just kind of itemize them in your mind along 3 points here. First, the first thing is that the similar story recorded by John in his gospel is helpful for understanding this event, whether or not John records the same event. So the similar story recorded by John is helpful for understanding this event, even if it is not perhaps the same exact event. That's the first thing I have to talk about today. Secondly, the word robber will only help you understand the passage if you also remember the violence of robbers. And here, of course, Jesus says they're making the house of God a robber's den. I want to talk about that word robber and make sure that we're all understanding that word correctly and filling it with everything that is there in that word robber. And then thirdly, the judgment of Jesus on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. So I'm going to talk about the overwhelming authority of Jesus and how it's on display as he enters the temple. So that'd be more of the divine king openly displaying his kingship to the people. Now, you also probably noticed there in the last point that I gave you that I use a phrase, the judgment of Jesus against the temple. Okay, speaking of this as an act of judgment. That is my name for this event here when Jesus enters the temple and starts flipping over those tables. When he attacks the temple, I consider it an act of judgment. You will notice that I have not called it, and I will try not to call it, the cleansing of the temple, which is normally what we call this event. I think even in my Bible, yes, the heading for this passage is the cleansing of the temple. That's a very common name for it. I have decided not to call it that. I consider that a very misleading title. My first reason is the passage itself does not call it that. So in the very least, I have permission to come up with a new title if I want to. Jesus himself didn't say, I have cleansed the temple. So if he didn't call it that, I can call it something else if I think it's best to do that. But the real reason I don't like that, calling it the cleansing of the temple, is we have no cause to believe that it was permanent, right? That he permanently cleansed the temple. I'm pretty sure after everything that happened there, they just, put their tables back up and started doing their buying and selling all over again after Jesus left. Pretty sure that's what happened. So it's not much of a cleansing. It's not as though it had much of a long-term effect, but it did send a message. It sent a very powerful message, which I think was a message of judgment. I prefer to call this event a judgment against the temple, in the very least because of the passages of Scripture that Jesus quotes, specifically the one from Jeremiah. Where the passage he quotes from Jeremiah is where he says that you're making the house of God a robber's den. He's quoting that passage from Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is certainly there in the temple, in his context, back in his day, speaking this prophecy of judgment against the temple. So Jesus, in the very least, is hearkening back to this earlier prophecy from an earlier prophet in which he is judging that temple and the house of God. And Jesus is putting himself right in line with Jeremiah as he does what he does here in the temple. So I think I'm on good ground here to say that this is meant to be an act of judgment performed by Jesus against the temple and everyone there. And I think by the time I'm finished with this series of sermons, you will see more of what I mean by that, why all of this constitutes an act of judgment. But for today, I'm going to concern myself with some background information to prime your minds, so to speak, for getting ready for all of that. So let's start with the first of those three divisions that I gave you. And we'll start with the one about the similar story in John's Gospel. The similar story recorded by John is helpful for understanding this event, whether or not John records the same exact event. So you can go ahead and turn to John chapter 2 if you want to. That's where I'll be for a little bit. John chapter 2 is where I will eventually read, and I'll go ahead and turn there as well. So, what's happening is this. In John's Gospel, toward the beginning of his Gospel, in chapter 2, he records a story very similar to this one that we're studying in Matthew. And I want to read this to you just so you can see how similar it is. His story goes on for quite a bit longer, but I do want to read the whole thing just so you can hear it all. This is John chapter 2, verse 13, and I'm going to read through 25. It says, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords." That's a whip, by the way, for those of you who have never heard the word scourge. He made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing his signs which he was doing. But Jesus on his part was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men. And because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. So John's account is much longer, but you see it is very similar in its major points to what Matthew records for us in his gospel. And of course, Matthew and John are not the only ones that record this kind of event. Luke and Mark as well record a story very similar to Matthew's, taking place in the last week of Jesus' ministry. Very similar. So you have these very similar accounts in all four gospels. And the question naturally arises, is John describing the same event as described by Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's very clear that they're describing the same basic thing. Then you see John's gospel and you wonder, is John also describing the same event as Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Now that question is a very hard question to answer. And I might even say it's impossible. I'm kind of reluctant to say that for certain just because there might be people smarter than me who can answer that question. But it seems to be one of those questions where you're just going to go round and round in circles and not really get anywhere. On the one hand, we might argue that John records the same event as the other Gospels. They're so similar, why not say they're the same thing, right? But the great problem with that is the timing of these events within the life of Jesus. John records this event toward the beginning of his Gospel, chapter 2. This is toward the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. But the other three Gospels record this event within the last week of Jesus' life, toward the end of things. So that's a pretty big difference there in where they place this event. Now it is true, and I've made this argument before, that the authors of our four Gospels are not always interested in giving events in chronological order. That's something we have to deal with as we compare these Gospels. They're not always interested in the order in which things happen. They're more interested in themes and conveying their ideas effectively. And sometimes that means moving a story around depending on what you're trying to say. And since the Gospels sometimes arrange their stories by topic or idea, it may not bother you that John will place his story about the temple at the beginning while everyone else places it at the end. After all, John might just think his ideas are better served by having that story toward the beginning. And that may be the case. However, it would still be a very great difference between John and the other Gospels. That would be the most radical difference that I can imagine if we really think about the order of events that all the Gospels use as they lay out the events of the life of Christ. John moving that story toward the beginning of things would be the biggest difference that I can think of anything like that. So that's pretty notable. That would be like writing a book about George Washington and putting his presidency at the beginning of the book rather than toward the end, where it belongs, so to speak. It's a pretty striking difference. So the timing of these events within the life of Jesus has made many Christians hesitant to affirm that John's account, that John's record of this, is in fact the same event as recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They just think that's too big of a change there for him to pull that all the way from the end toward the beginning and say it's the same exact event. Some Christians are very hesitant to say that. And so, some Christians go to the other side of things and affirm that John is describing a different event than the other three Gospels, which would mean that there are two times when Jesus attacked the temple. There was one time at the beginning of his ministry that's recorded by John, and another different event at the end that's recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that answer satisfies quite a few Christians, and many Christians don't have a problem with that, but it is somewhat problematic, and other people point out those problems in their own way. Bear in mind, if John is indeed describing a different event, it would mean that Jesus did much the same thing twice in his ministry, that we had two very similar events that happened in the same exact place, just very similar, at two different times in his life. Now, some of that is just, okay, well, there are different blind people that Jesus heals, different times he argues with the Pharisees. We don't have a problem with those stories, right, even though they're similar. But in this case, what you have is two incredibly similar actions, similar motivations, same exact place, but performed years apart. We have a saying about lightning not striking twice, and this would seem to be an event where lightning struck twice, so to speak. If Jesus were to cleanse the temple twice, if he were to attack the temple twice, I'll use my own phrasing there, it just seems kind of odd. And a lot of Christians are like, well, that just seems like too much of a stretch. It's one thing to heal two different blind people in two different places under two different circumstances, but for Jesus to be in the same place, do the same thing, for the same motivation, two different times in his ministry, that's too much, according to some Christians. So whether you go to the one side or the other, whether you say they're the same event or different events, it's kind of problematic either way. It's not the kind of thing where we can say for sure what's actually going on here. It's very much a classic dilemma. No matter what opinion you have of this, you're going to have problems with it that you can't quite answer confidently and that you certainly cannot answer to everyone's satisfaction. However, none of that is the point I'm actually trying to make. I'm just kind of laying out for you the ordinary debate that happens when we consider these stories. The point that I'm really trying to make is that John's account can be helpful for understanding Matthew's account regardless of whether they're the same event. Regardless of whether they actually are the same story being told in two different places, regardless of any of that, we can actually draw insight from John's gospel and apply that to what Matthew has for us. Now, when I get to my third message in this series, I plan to explain something in Matthew's account by appealing to John's account. So just to tell you where I'm going with all of this, I actually do plan to come back to John's account later and make an argument from John's gospel about what Matthew has recorded. I think that's valid. I think it's valid whether or not John is recording the same exact event. And I believe that because they are, without any doubt, the same kind of event. Even if they're not the same exact event told in different accounts there, they are in fact the same kind of event. And that creates a link between them that I think is important. If, for example, you were studying one of the passages about Jesus healing a leper, you would have every right to consider that passage with the help of other times when Jesus healed lepers. You don't have to isolate yourself to the one story where Jesus healed this one leper. You could study all of them together. You could even perhaps bring in other healing stories from Jesus and use all of that to gain insight into the one story you're studying about that one leper healed on that one occasion. Also, you might consider a story where Jesus goes home to Nazareth, and you might study that account by appealing to other accounts where Jesus goes home to Nazareth on other occasions, because there's at least two that I can think of where he does that, and they're both very similar. Jesus goes back to his hometown, doesn't necessarily get a warm welcome there. You can pull all of that together and study one passage using the other passage, even if they're not the same exact event, because they're the same kind of event. In the same way, I think we have that opportunity and that right in studying these incidents when Jesus attacks the temple and he performs these acts of judgment against the temple. Even if they're not the same exact event, they're still the same kind of event, which allows us to draw upon one story to explain details in the other. I think all of that is valid. Since John and Matthew and also Mark and Luke are describing the same kind of event, we can use all of those accounts together to talk about any one of them, regardless of whether they are exactly the same event or not. So that is my thinking on that. So when I get to my third message and I make the argument from John's gospel that I have in mind, I just want you to know why I'm doing that, why I think it's valid, even if we can't affirm necessarily that John is recording the same exact event from the life of Jesus. And that's all I have to say about John's account for now. I will come back to that later in this series. But for now, that's all I have to say about John 2. Let's move on to something else. This is another point here in my outline where I'm going to be belaboring a point that maybe doesn't seem all that significant to you, but I think it's important. I think it corrects problems later on. So right now I want to cover it. I want to talk about this word, robber. The word robber will only help us understand this passage if we also remember the violence of robbers. Okay, so violence, like hurting somebody, fighting, that kind of thing. You have to remember that as you think about a robber, or else I don't think you're really going to get everything Jesus has to say when he quotes that passage from Jeremiah about turning the temple into a robber's den. So let's start with that word, robber. We need a definition. And I'm again interested in the children helping me perhaps define this word. Kids, you know what a robber is? Anybody want to try? Esther, let's try you here. What do you think? They steal. Okay, that's basically correct. They do steal, but it is a very specific kind of stealing, and that's really what I want to talk about, what it means to actually be a robber. Now again, this is a word that Jesus uses in our passage. I want to read that again so you see it, just to make sure you know where I'm going here. Matthew 21, verse 12 through 13 says, Jesus entered the temple, drove out all of those who were buying and selling in the temple, overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den. All right, so what Jesus describes there happening in the temple, he describes it as turning the temple into a den of robbers. And of course, he's getting that again from Jeremiah. That's Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, by the way. We will eventually study that passage, but not today. Just want to sort of flag that for you. That is Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. So that's how Jeremiah described what Israel was doing back then. That's how Jesus describes what people were doing in his own day, turning this house into a den of robbers. Now, I want to spend some time on that word because I think it's important. Here is the definition of robbery that I want to give you. I found this online. I think this is the technical definition of robbery. Robbery is the crime of taking or attempting to take anything of value by force or the threat of force or by putting the victim in fear. So robbery is the crime of taking or attempting to take anything of value by force or threat of force or by putting the victim in fear. So that is robbery. So that is a kind of stealing, like Esther said, but it's a very specific kind of stealing, isn't it? Robbery is not the act of sneaking up behind a person and picking his pocket, trying to steal without him knowing it. That's a kind of thievery, but that's not robbery. Robbery is sneaking up behind the person, hitting him over the head with a hammer, going through his pockets, and then throwing his body in the ditch. That is robbery. That's what a robber does. This is a person who uses violence or fear to steal from people. This is like worse than your ordinary thief. This is a violent man and is using his violence to steal from people. Now, I'm belaboring this point because I think whenever people hear the word robbery, they think less often of the violence and more often of the stealing. They hear robber and they think, oh, stealing. Probably because we are not accustomed today to encountering robbers on the highway. You know, we're not out there walking around. There aren't robbers everywhere you got to look out for. You're just driving in your car. I mean, the world's a lot safer now than it was back then. So we don't think about what a robber actually is and what a robber actually does. Back then, they knew it all about it. You know, robbers were a very real threat. But so, I mean, you have this problem, this disconnect here, where I think people hear the word robbery and robber, and they think specifically of the stealing, but they don't seem to get the idea of violence in there, that I think is very important. I want you to focus a little less on the thievery and a little more on the violence of robbers, because I think it characterizes them even more than the actual stealing does. And I think you'll understand what Jesus says and what Jeremiah says a little better if you have that in your mind. So let's talk about this in some more detail. I have an actual argument here showing you that the words used in our Bibles actually does refer to a violent kind of thief, a robber, someone who commits acts of violence as he steals. I want to start with the Hebrew word used by Jeremiah and show you some passages from the Old Testament. You don't have to flip around to all of these. I'm just going back and forth here and there, finding places where this word or related words are used, but I want to talk about this. Now, the word used by Jeremiah when he made his original prophecy was the word faritz. Okay, so faritz is the Hebrew word for robber. And the root idea behind this word, when you get down to its root idea, is the idea of breaking. You know, so smashing. You know, this is a person who performs acts of destruction. That is the root idea of the word, and the verb certainly means that. The related verb, the action word, that's part of this word group, certainly refers to destroying things. My example is 2 Chronicles, verse 37 in chapter 20 of 2 Chronicles. Just to read that to you. Oh, let's see here. Did I misplace it? 2 Chronicles 20:37. Please be right. Here it is. Okay. It says, then, this is just some event from history, right? Okay, then Eleazar, the son of Dodavahu of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have allied yourself with Ahaziah, the Lord has destroyed your works. And that's the word that's related to the word for robbery. That's the verb form of it. The word that I'm talking about here, they translate it as destroy, right? So this is a word that talks about destroying something. So there's the verb form of it, you know, very much referring to this idea of destroying something. Now this carries over into the adjective, so the description word, the word they use to describe something else, an adjective. This word is very often used to describe, guess what? Wild animals. This is a word used to describe animals that are dangerous to humans. So here from Isaiah, just to give you an example of the adjective being used, Isaiah 35, verse 9, one of these promises for the age to come, says, no lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go up on it. You know, those will not be found there, but the redeemed will walk there. So vicious, that's the same word group that we're talking about here that belongs to this word robber. So these vicious beasts, these wild animals, so they're not out there stealing things. I mean, animals don't steal from humans necessarily, but a vicious beast, the problem with those things is they're going to attack you. They are violent, they are destructive beasts. So that same word group is used to describe those kinds of animals. And from there, it seems like the same word group was applied to people who show the same kind of violent or destructive tendency. This example is from Ezekiel 18, verse 10. So now talking about actual people and using this group of words to describe them. Ezekiel 18:10. This is just Ezekiel talking about how God deals with men. It says, then he may have a violent son who sheds blood and who does any of these things to a brother. So a violent son, the word that we translate violent, is from this same word group, the faritz group, talking about, you know, destructing, you know, breaking, destroying things. A violent son. And this is the word group that eventually was applied to robbers. But so far we haven't seen anything about stealing, have we? It's all been about the destructive tendencies of all these actions and these people. The root idea of this word and its related words is very much about destruction. Not a whole lot on stealing. Now that does come into things at some point. At some point they started to use this word of people who steal, but it is of course a very destructive and violent kind of stealing. One example is also here in Ezekiel, talking about when the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and burned down the temple and all that. Ezekiel 7:21 through 22 says this, I will give it into the hands of the foreigners as plunder, and to the wicked of the earth as spoil, and they will profane it. I will also turn my face from them, and they will profane my secret place. Then robbers will enter and profane it. So there's the word actually translated as robbers, but they're not just stealing. They are sacking this place. The temple was burned down. They took everything out of it. They're killing people as they go. This is an army of robbers, basically. And they're not just like picking people's pockets. I mean, this is a destructive form of stealing. That's what this word means when it says robbers. Now, I want to go to that passage in Jeremiah just briefly and show you one thing here from this passage. It's fitting, after all, Jesus is quoting this passage, so might as well go there. Jeremiah 7, verse 11. I want to read this passage from Jeremiah now because it comes closest to establishing the idea of robber. Just as we think of a robber, a guy out there on the highway looking to steal from somebody, just think about what he says here. When he gives this judgment against the temple and against the people there, he says this, has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? Okay, think about that. A den of robbers. So for those of you kids who don't know this word, a den, usually it's a cave, some kind of secret place. This is where people go to hide. You know, ordinary people don't live in a den. Ordinary people live in a house, in a town, with other people around them. Robbers can't do that because robbers are such violent people, people that they strike fear into everyone. They can't just live in society. It doesn't work that way. You can't be a robber and live in a town. You can't be a robber and have a next door neighbor. If you're going to live a life of robbery, you got to find some secret place out in the middle of nowhere, like a cave or something, to be your den, to be your hideout, because you're not welcome with other people. Other people don't want you around. You're a robber. You got to go find a hiding place and hide there, hide all the stuff you steal there, and you come out to steal from more people and take it back there because nobody likes you. No one wants to be around you. That's what a robber's life is like. And usually there's more than one of them working together, so they all kind of hang out in this den together. That's the image that Jeremiah gives there of a den of robbers. So there's where you see the typical outlaw, the violent outlaw who makes his living by attacking people and taking their stuff. They have a den because they're out there living in the middle of nowhere because they can't live in a town with other people. So there you have it, the idea of a robber, the actual criminal outlaw robber who steals from people by force. So, all of that to say, the Hebrew word used by Jeremiah, faritz, for robber, refers very much to the violence that takes place. Certainly there is this idea of becoming a robber and stealing, but the idea of violence is far more present in the word that was used in Hebrew for these robbers. The idea of thievery comes into it indirectly by implication of how these people have to live. I mean, if you're this kind of man, you can't make an honest living. You got to make your living off of other people. So you're going to be stealing, but while you're stealing, you're going to be knocking people out and killing people and all that kind of stuff. Robbers are violent kinds of thieves, as the Hebrew word even implies by the words that they use there. Now, all of that so far good for Hebrew. Let's talk about Greek, because of course, eventually the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. Our Gospels about Jesus were written in Greek, so we have to deal with Greek at some point. And the Greek word used to translate this Hebrew word also refers to violence a little bit more than to stealing. So in Greek, there are two words that are used for someone who steals. This is a point where Greek has some nuance to it, and really, I guess English does too if we think about it for a moment. But in Greek, there are two different words here for someone who steals. The first word group is the klepto group. And of course, we get the word kleptomaniac from this word group. This is a person who steals, yes, but this is the kind of person who steals in secret. You know, this is thievery. This is things done by stealth. It's that kind of stealing. The other word group is the lestes word group. So lestes. Lestes is the kind of man who does not care for secrecy, but steals by force. This is the kind of person who is exactly what we've been talking about, a robber, someone who steals by force. Now, the New Testament gives us a wonderful example of a lestes, a robber, someone who steals by force. Luke chapter 10, verse 30, from the story of the Good Samaritan. Again, I'll just be there briefly, but I want to read this to you because it's exactly what I've been describing. Luke 10, verse 30 says, Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. And they stripped him, and they beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead. I mean, there you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That's a robber. That's a person who steals by force. That is a lestes, to use the Greek word that is used there. That is what we're talking about here. And if you saw that event happen, if you actually saw that man get jumped by these robbers, you wouldn't say, they just stole from that guy. That is the last thing on your mind. What you're going to say to yourself is, well, did they just kill that guy? I mean, is he okay? Now, of course, we know as the story goes on, some people didn't even care about that. But if you were to see that, and if you had any compassion at all, you're not worried about the clothes they stripped off of him. You're worried about this man's life. That's what it's like when you fall among robbers, when you fall in with a lestes. This is a violent kind of thief. So back to Jeremiah. When Jeremiah, a Hebrew book, was translated into Greek, and they got to that phrase, den of robbers, they used the word lestes to translate that. So not the stealthy kind of thief, but the violent kind of thief. That's the word they used to translate that phrase back there in Jeremiah. Furthermore, when Matthew records the actions of Jesus in the temple, and when Jesus quotes Jeremiah, Matthew used the Greek word lestes for the violent kind of robber that Jeremiah was talking about. So even in Greek translation, the idea of violence is very prominent. It's not just the idea of stealing there, this idea of robbery. Robbery is more than that. Robbery is the violent kind of stealing. Now, why should you care about any of this? Well, I admit I'm not quite ready to make my full point on this yet. I'm just kind of laying out the idea. But here's what I will tell you. In Matthew 21, I do not think Jesus meant for us to consider stealing as the chief sin of the people in the temple. Very often, when Christians talk about this passage, it is totally a matter of ways that people might be stealing from other people there in the temple. I really don't think that's the big thing Jesus has in his mind. Because Jesus doesn't just use a word for stealing, he uses a word for robbery. I mean, a word that evokes images of violence and force, of hurting people and of killing people. Jesus used that word and that prophecy from Jeremiah for a reason. There's something there. There's something more to this than just stealing from somebody. And I want to get to the bottom of that. And eventually I will get there. I have to, lay out some more pieces over the next few messages. But for right now, I just want to get the idea in your head. A robber is more than just a thief. A robber is a violent person who lives at the edge of society because he's dangerous. I want to get that idea in your mind as we talk about these events in the temple. So just bear that in mind, and we'll talk more about it in future sermons. Okay, one more thing for today. One more piece of background information. The judgment of Jesus on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. All right, so now talking about something with the person of Jesus, something about Jesus himself as he goes in there, flipping over these tables, chasing people around. My whole point here is to answer a question that I had on my mind for many years before I could finally answer it sufficiently to my own satisfaction. Here's the question I had. Why did nobody stop Jesus from attacking the temple? Why did nobody do anything? Why didn't they stop him? I mean, think about the scene here. Imagine if you were present on that day, and if you were a person of even some physical courage. I mean, just think about what you would have done. It says, Jesus entered the temple and drove out all of those who were buying and selling in the temple, so driving them out, making them run for the door, and overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. I mean, that's not his stuff. What right does he have to go in there flipping over those tables? And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a robber's den. All right, so there's Jesus flipping over the tables, chasing people around, all that happening. Now, children, just to get you children here to think about this along with me, how do you react if you're maybe building something or you're working on something? Maybe it's a picture, maybe you're building something with blocks or whatever, and maybe your brother or sister comes in and starts messing it up. Okay, do you like that? Is that good? What do you do? What do you do when your brother or your sister comes and starts messing with your stuff? You build it again. Okay, they probably did that too, but what do you do before that? Stop them. Yeah, you're like, stop it. Leave my stuff alone. You go tell mom and dad maybe, or you just, well, hopefully you don't hit them, but maybe you do. I'm sure it happens from time to time. You're going to do something. You don't want someone messing with your stuff. Well, Jesus comes in here. He starts flipping over people's tables, chasing people around. He is messing with everyone's stuff, and no one's stopping him. He's just doing this completely unhindered. No one's doing anything. So again, I ask the question, why is nobody stopping Jesus from wrecking the temple at this point? It seems like the kind of thing you would do if you were there. You would say, whoa, whoa, whoa. You would at least go up to the man and just try to get his attention and stop him. You would do something. But Jesus, he just keeps doing this and no one's preventing him. So I've had this question for a long time, and I feel like I eventually got all the pieces to fit together. And my answer to this is the judgment of Jesus on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. It is the overwhelming authority of Jesus that is at work here that prevents anyone from messing with him as he's messing with stuff in the temple. Overwhelming would be the key word in overwhelming authority. Now, before I go any further with that, I want to make a point that will highlight all of this for you and perhaps make my question a little more pressing for you. And here's the point I want to make. The temple in Jerusalem was policed in the day of Jesus. There were people there whose job it was to keep order. They were there and they did nothing when Jesus walked into the temple and started doing stuff. First, let's talk about the Romans, the Roman soldiers that were present there. They were policing the temple in the days of Jesus. In fact, the Romans had a fortress that was built higher than the temple, right next to the temple, overlooking the temple, so they could watch things happening in the temple. It was called the Antonia Fortress, and it was where they camped out to make sure everything just kept calm there in the temple. All right? You got to remember, the temple's a busy place, a lot of people coming and going. It's a place where religious fervor gets stirred up very easily, and these Jews are a pretty rebellious people. We know they don't like us, so we got to keep an eye on this temple to make sure nothing gets started here that we can't stop. So the Romans had a fortress right there overlooking the temple where they could look into it and see things happening and intervene if they had to. They were on this. The Romans were watching this particular corner of their empire because they knew this is a place where trouble could start. Now, I would like to read to you about an event that actually happened in the temple where these Roman soldiers actually did intervene in a disturbance in the temple. Can anyone think of where I'm going here? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, it's from the life of Paul. Acts 21. This is in the New Testament. Not much further down the road than this time here. I mean, this would have been a generation later, maybe. Acts 21. This is when Paul goes to Jerusalem. He's in the temple. He's going through his purification ceremony, kind of a compromise with the Jewish believers there. And he gets into some trouble here. Acts 21, verse 27. I'm going to read through 33. When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him, that's Paul, in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple, and he has defiled the holy place. for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and he began asking who he was and what he had done. So there you see an example of this ruckus starting in the temple. The Romans see it, they're on it. I mean, they just jump in there and they seek to maintain order right there. Okay, so you see that they can effectively police the temple from their position in that fortress overlooking the temple. So why didn't they do something when Jesus starts flipping over tables? Why aren't they doing anything now? Okay, that's an interesting question, but here's another one. So those guys, the Romans, they're outside the temple, looking down in the temple and policing the temple from a distance. The Jews actually had their own police force inside the temple. So they're even closer. They're right there. They had actual temple guards whose whole job, again, was to maintain order inside the temple. This goes back to the time of King David. It was King David who originally organized some of the Levites to be a police force for the temple. We're not going to go back and read it now, but if you're interested, you can read from 1 Chronicles 26, where David is kind of putting things in order for the temple and for the priests and the Levites. One of the things he does is he establishes some of the Levites to be a police force for the temple. They're supposed to guard this place. And those people were still at work in the days of Jesus. At some point in the Gospels, you will see references to the officers of the temple and other phrases like that. Those are the Levitical guards. Those are the people whose task it is to maintain order inside the temple. So the Romans are looking down on the temple from above, trying to make sure nothing goes wrong there. You have Jewish police officers in the temple itself trying to maintain order, and none of them are doing anything when Jesus shows up and starts ransacking the place. Isn't this their job? I mean, we have this saying, you had one job. When someone has one job to do and they mess it up, we say, you had one job. Well, the Roman soldiers there had one job. They're not doing it. The Jewish Levitical police officers there, they had one job. They're not doing it. Why is nobody doing their job when Jesus goes into the temple and starts turning over those tables and pouring out those coins and chasing people around? Why? Why is that not happening? Isn't it their job to stop vandals and things like that? So what's happening here? Why are they not intervening? Well, again, I told you that my answer to this question is that the judgment of Jesus on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. That is how I answer my question of many years, and I will give you some detail here in a minute after I refresh my vocal cords. Okay, so let's think about this, and let's take it to something that is a little more down to earth. Among humans, there's this funny thing about humans. If a person looks as though he belongs somewhere or looks as though he knows what he's doing, people tend to leave that person alone. It's the suspicious looking people that we pay attention to, but if someone is just kind of going about his business as though he owns the place, so to speak, I mean, we just kind of leave that person be because we don't want to mess with that person because, well, he looks like he belongs here. He looks like he knows what he's doing. He looks like the person in charge. We see that, and that's how we respond to those kinds of people. Now, some few people have that same kind of appearance to a very great degree. We say that they have presence. We say that they have a bearing about them. We use those kinds of phrases to describe that kind of person. Not everyone has that, few people do, but if you've ever met such a person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think that kind of authoritative presence goes part of the way to explaining what Jesus does in the temple, and not only in the temple, but in other times in his life, when he also encounters a situation where maybe people would do something, but they don't do anything. I think that kind of authoritative presence is part of the answer. Let me read you another event from the life of Jesus where I think this is on display even more powerfully than in the temple. This is from Luke chapter 4. So jumping over to another gospel here. Luke 4:28, verse 30. This is one of those times where he goes home to Nazareth and does not receive a warm welcome, as I had mentioned earlier. And let's see here. Luke 4:28 says, "And all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things. And they got up and drove Jesus out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built in order to throw him down the cliff." So they're going to throw Jesus off a cliff right now for the things he just said to them. But passing through their midst, he went his way. It's like, well, that was easy. Like, you wonder, how is he going to get away from this crowd that's bent on killing him? Well, they get to the top of that hill. No one can push him over. I mean, they just stop, and he just walks right through the middle of them. So you have that kind of thing where these people are enraged enough to try to kill Jesus, but they can't actually do it. He just walks through. I suspect while Jesus was ransacking the temple, I suspect that a great many people wanted to stop him, but nobody did. They did not because they could not. And they could not because, even if they hated Jesus, no one could deny the sense of authority with which he performed his actions. I think it's fair to say, in the very least, Jesus was one of those people who had that bearing about him, who had that presence about him that just made people back away, and they don't actually want to lay a hand on him most of the time. Now, I think all of that is probably escalated to a greater degree by the fact that he's not just a man. He's not just a man with presence or bearing. He's the Son of God. And however much of himself he emptied when he became a man, there were some things he still had. And I think being the Son of God goes a long way in explaining the rest of this, why people just don't mess with him at a time when you would expect him to be stopped or be hindered. Jesus, I think, always looked as though he belonged where he was, and always looked as though he knew what he was doing, and always looked as though he did things with conviction, so that no one ever stopped him until the time actually God had appointed for his death. At that point, the protection from God is off. He is ready to submit himself to death. At that time, they can just do whatever they want to him. But until that moment, the overwhelming authority of Jesus that's so evident in his character is going to prevent anyone from laying a hand on him. Whether they're going to throw him off of a cliff, whether they're going to jump on him as he's turning those tables over, no matter what, they're just not going to do anything to him because he has this kind of overwhelming authoritative presence. I think that's what explains all of this. It's the only explanation I can give for why no one is intervening in these events as Jesus is there attacking the temple. So that's how I answer that question, in case you've had the same question. And all of that, of course, as I said at the beginning, is simply background information for my later messages on this same passage. I have two more planned. Let's go ahead and do a summary of these things so they can stay in your mind, and then we'll close down and get ready for our mealtime. All right, so 3 pieces of background information as Jesus attacks the temple. First, I said that the similar story recorded by John is helpful for understanding this event, whether or not John records the same event. So again, you have this similar story in John chapter 2, and the question is raised, is John describing the same exact event as Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Well, on the one hand, it's simply not clear whether John does indeed describe the same event. It could be the same event. It could be a different but similar event happening at a different time. It's just not abundantly clear. However, the point I was making is that they are the same kind of event. They're both these incidents where Jesus goes into the temple and drives people out and interferes with the operations going on there. They're both the same kind of event, and therefore we can make observations from John's account which can help us understand Matthew's account. And eventually in this mini-series on these events, I will do that. I will actually appeal to John's gospel to explain something in Matthew. So please remember the point I was trying to make today on that. The second thing I discussed was the word robber. I said the word robber will only help us understand this passage if we also remember the violence of robbers. Okay? And I've stated my complaint that many people hear the word robber and they think only of the stealing, whereas in reality there's much more to being a robber than just stealing. Instead, you need to remember the concept of violence as part of the activities of a robber. The very Hebrew word has more of a connection to violence than even to stealing. The Greek word used is very much for a person who steals with violence. That's very plain in the word lestes. And those are the words being used by Jeremiah and by Jesus. So we have to remember that as we study this passage. And all of that then points us in the direction of more than just stealing. Jesus has something else on his mind besides just thievery there in the temple. We need to be aware of that as we continue with our study of this passage. And then last of all, I said that the judgment of Jesus on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. And this, of course, is my attempt to answer the question, why did nobody stop Jesus from attacking the temple? Roman soldiers did not intervene. Jewish police officers did not intervene. The merchants who were there did not intervene. I mean, no one's stopping Jesus. Why not? My answer to that was that Jesus always had such an appearance and presence of authority that no one was ever able to stop him from doing anything until it was time for him to die. Some of that is explicable on the basis of just this trait of humans. Some people have this kind of presence or bearing, but what Jesus had was probably more than that by virtue of the fact that he was the Son of God. And all of that, I think, contrived to make people unwilling to just jump him and tackle him and those kinds of things, especially when he was there in the temple, when it seems like it should have happened. Okay, again, those are 3 pieces of background information. I will move on to my next message in this series when I teach next. Next time, I'll be focusing on the 2 passages quoted by Jesus when he gives the reason for why he did what he did. One of them is, of course, from Jeremiah chapter 7. The other, where he talks about the house being a house of prayer, that is from Isaiah 56. So if you do want to read those passages for next time, that'd be good. That's where I'll be next time. I'll be more in those Old Testament passages than in Matthew when I teach next. So that is all I have to say for today. I am open to questions or comments on these things that I've talked about today, and I will try to answer the questions as I can.